In this video, we will review how to identify with one race when you are Puerto Rican. You can review what I previously stated in the video before this one, which is how to identify with one race when you're Puerto Rican part 1. So upon making this video, one of the criteria for evaluation that I picked for this video was learning what ethnic group each country mainly represents, whether it be for your own study or whether it be for your own DNA test. What you have to understand for these DNA tests is that they mainly express within the results what country you are coming from, but they are not expressing which group you are coming from. For instance, when I took the DNA test, let's say that the Irish results tell me that I am Irish, but what exactly is Irish when in fact in the island of Ireland you had a whole bunch of groups that were probably not only Celtic, and then it says that I am Portuguese, but when in fact not all of the components of that country are Celtic. They may have North African, and I would also like to clarify what is a North African. They come from a Caucasian background. They are not from actual Negroid African. They are mainly of Caucasian descent. So there is a lot of things that I had to investigate in order to reach these conclusions to help me further understand, identify with one race. And I'm going to be honest with you, there are two possibilities. You either can identify with one race, or either you cannot, and then you have like a mixture of a whole bunch of races. And here's where I may help or I may not. Why do I say this? Because Puerto Ricans identify other Puerto Ricans mainly by what is your reigning ethnical physical appearance. Like, let's take a mulatto for example. A mulatto is a person that is expressing half white, half African features. This person is expressing broadly curly hair, or hair that is rather African, like afro hair. This person is expressing the African skin, is expressing, for instance, may express an African nose and some other African features like the lips, that when you enter the Puerto Rican culture, then all of a sudden you are identified as being African. And this doesn't mean that you are African. This just means that within the cultural Puerto Rico, you are being identified as African because of all the broad mixes that are happening in the island. So if you're asking me, can a mulatto identify with being Spanish? Can a mulatto identify with being Irish or from Portugal? My answer is yes. The person is half one ethnicity and then half the other. The person may identify with one or may identify with both races. So me as being Puerto Rican, how do I then identify with one race? It's really hard. Physically, I always knew that my family represented this Caucasian type people that were mixed with indigenous people, and then I came out a little bit extra indigenous. My father comes from this family who are mestizo, and that's where most of my indigenous appearance is coming from. So I mainly identify with being mestizo. What does this mean? I identify with a person from Puerto Rico that has white family and that has indigenous family, making me look like I'm not white, making me look like I'm not indigenous, but I'm somewhere in between. By this, I mean physically. So if you want to learn a little bit more of my story, I still have some stories that I would like to share. Like, for instance, my mom used to say that I would look like this person from Andalusia, and then I was like, what? Then I'm Andaluz? Because of my tan skin and because of my appearance. kind of appeared like an Afro-Asiatic people, like an Afro-Asian person, like an Afro-Asiatic person. I felt like the mix just was not fully understood, but then my mother understood that I was like Spanish from the South, but later on I understood that this was more of my mom's bias onto races, and she ultimately preferred being identified with like a Southern Spanish person, Southern Spanish woman, which would be Andaluz. And that's just how my mom identified me, because of her own bias. And this was not based on my own DNA. This was way before making my own DNA test. My family identified me with being from Andalusia. They identified me with being mestizo, which is called indiecito. If you want to know of what it is, you can go to the part 1 of this video. Then I would start to imagine myself if I would be integrated into the Spanish culture. And then it hit me. I was like, wait, I'm not feeling like if I come from Spain, even though I do have Spanish features, even though I do have Celtic Iberian features, I am not completely Celtic Iberian. I don't fit the full-on Spanish appearance. I looked myself in the mirror and I was like, there's something wrong. I felt something was off with the narrative that I was Spanish, when in fact, like I said, I looked myself in the mirror and I saw something else. When you are Puerto Rican, you can identify with one race and you may not at the same time. It's pretty hard. So I identified with something else. What was I? I don't know. I just know that I just looked like I wasn't somebody from Spain. I felt like if I went to Spain, people would tell me that I was from somewhere else, that people would probably make fun of me, fun of my differences. So I started investigating, I started doing research, and I started researching people from southern Spain, from Andalusia, and like I wouldn't even compare myself to the people from northern Spain, because people from northern Spain are just too Caucasian in order for myself to compare to them. So I researched onto these people from southern Spain and I analyzed their features, and I was like, wait a minute, I don't look like these people that come from southern Spain. They look like they're Spanish. They have, that Spanish look. Even though southern Spain was conquered by Muslims and they were conquered by a whole bunch of different people, they still kept a reigning ethnical physical appearance that seemed that they were Caucasian, when in my case, if I were to go to Spain, like I already stated, I would look totally different. So I had the chance to take the DNA test, and I started to discover all of my ranges and all of my results and where was I from and all of these people that just mixed with my family, and it was really interesting, and I learned so much from looking at my DNA results. When I took my DNA test, then I had even more questions. I discovered that I was 17% Native American, 12% African, and Caucasian 70%. When I did my DNA predictions, these were my predictions. I predicted that I was going to be really high Caucasian. I predicted that I was from 15% to 20% Native, and somewhere around that percentage of African. Even though my family never stated that we had African, I still knew deep inside that we must have had some African. Now I started to investigate more deeply into how to read my DNA results. Then I discovered that I was able to understand my DNA results even further by analyzing the ranges. Beforehand, I want you to understand that when I put 1% Mali, I don't know if they mean Mali by the Ghanaian kingdom or the North African Tuareg people of Africa. It's really hard because Ancestry DNA, this is how they put the groupings. They put the groupings like if they were countries. And it's really hard for me to understand if by Mali they mean people from the Maghreb, like Maghrebi, who are North African, or do they mean the Ghanaian people that come from Mali, but I'm 100% not sure. So if you want to help me, leave it down below in the comments. What is your analysis? Does Ancestry DNA mean by 1% Mali and by the country of Mali, or do they mean the Tuareg people of the Maghreb who are Caucasian? But I will leave that for debate. Upon reading my ranges on the native one, I discovered that my Taino could range from 13% to 22%, and then I had 1% Guarani and 1% from the Central America, making me a total of 24% Native American. I discovered that I was between a range of 24% and 15% Native American because of what the percentages say. That's what I found out, that's what I concluded. But I still was questioning why did I look so mestizo if I was only up to 24% Native American and 70% Caucasian, which is a really high percentage. Then I found out how the percentages work when you go into the website and you click on the Caucasian percentages deeper onto what they range. So I want to make the same game that I made with the Native American, that I discovered what was the possible range. And this is the thing that I discovered, that my Native American stays from 15% to 24%, and that's a really high number in the terms that this number stays a double-digit number rather than other percentages that go from whatever the percentage was down to zero. So let's see how the game works when I look upon the ranges of Caucasian and I go subtracting all of the ranges that go down to zero. Like, yeah, I discovered that all of these Caucasian ranges are able to range down to zero. Unlike Native, which stays a rather high number, these Caucasian ethnicities have shown me that they can still range down to zero. So I was like, maybe this could explain why do I still look like if I was mestizo, like if I was half Native, half Caucasian. And this is what I found out. So let's subtract from this number all of the Caucasian ethnicities that may range down to zero. So let's begin and let's see how that looks like. My highest percentage for Caucasian was Spain. And if I subtract the 37% down to 31%, it goes, my total Caucasian percentage goes down to 64%. My second highest Caucasian percentage was Portugal at 14%, but it may range down to 5%. So if I subtract the 14% for Portugal and I add the 5%, it ranges down to a 55% Caucasian. My third Caucasian percentage was Ireland at a 9%. if I subtract the 9% and I add the 0%, which it ranges down to 0, it equals to a total of 46%. My fourth highest Caucasian ethnic group is North Africa at 4%, which also it goes down to 0. If I subtract the 4%, it goes down to 42%. I have South Italy at 2%. It ranges down to 0. It gives me a 40% total Caucasian. Then my next one is Scotland at 2%, also ranging down to 0, giving me a 38% total Caucasian. And then I have European Jewish at 2%, also ranging down to 0, giving me a total of 36% Caucasian. So this means that I can be 70% Caucasian down to 36% Caucasian. That's 1/3 Caucasian, comparing that 36% to the 24% that doesn't go down to 0. It doesn't go down to 0. Native American doesn't go down to 0 like most of these percentages. So what I'm trying to say is that this analysis explains 100% why do I look like a mestizo? Why do I look half Caucasian, half Native American? Because the difference between 24% and the ranges that the Caucasian give me, which ranges, all of them range down to 0%, equals to a 36% possible Caucasian. This is what the study suggests if you dig deeper onto what the ranges are. This test is telling me that even if I can be up to 70% Caucasian, I can also be 36% Caucasian. Comparing 36 with the 24 is a really small number, making me looking like if I was mestizo. This is perfectly explaining me why is my phenotypical information the way it is. Why do I physically look like if I have Native American features and not all the way to a 70% Caucasian? Why don't I look like if I was 70% Caucasian? Because these ranges, all of them, go down to 0%. But Native, it stays to a solid 13%, 15%, 22%, and it can also be all summed up to 24%. So this is explaining also my phenotypical belief of being a mestizo. This is also explaining my genotype. My genotype, it is perfectly explaining my genotype. This doesn't happen with anybody else. This doesn't happen with everybody. This is one of those rare occasions when a Puerto Rican may keep on the mestizo look, even for how Caucasian the test may indicate. And it still tells me that I can still be a 36% Caucasian. If the test says that I can be 36% Caucasian and 70% Caucasian, that is what I range from 36% to 70%. And it goes down to 36%. Mestizo is what the genotypical information and the phenotypical information is indicating, and this is explaining my physical belief and my blood belief. Now, I may also have this African admixture. For instance, I have 7% for Cameroon, Congo, and Western Bantu peoples, and I have 4% for Senegal. But this genotypical information is not being expressed the way that these are being expressed. The African in my family is rarely seen because of what I said with the culture. Your appearance will indicate your race. It will indicate your ethnicity when you are inside of the Puerto Rican culture. That is what the people are gonna say. That is what you are gonna think. And what might the test indicate? This is what the test is indicating. Even though I can identify as being African, physically I look like a mestizo, a mix between these two, and genotypically the information is indicating that I am mostly a mix of these two. So that is one way to identify with one race when you are Puerto Rican. I'm not identifying with one race. I am identifying with two races. I am identifying with maybe half of this amount of Caucasian and what the range of Native American is really explaining in what my test is revealing to me. So this is my belief, and this is what the science says about me. And if this information were to be more onto this side, then I will probably identify with being a mulatto, African, half white, half African. But it's not indicating that I look like an African. I do love my African people. I do love my African side. And I knew all of this time that I had the African admixture, but it's not clearly expressing itself like it's expressing with the Native American and the Caucasian percentages that I possess. Now that is how to identify with one race when you are Puerto Rican 1.5. I just want you to be reminded to love the way you look, accept the way you are, and I'm not saying not to identify with your preferred ethnicity. I'm saying that there's a lot of factors that might contribute with one's race when you are a Puerto Rican. There's a lot of factors that might contribute, and mostly the physical traits won't lie, and mostly the genotypical information won't lie. There will be an explanation for the way that you are looking. Some people have such a balanced Caucasian, Native, and African that is like really hard for these people to identify with one race. But those people are mainly called trigueño. So if you are a trigueño, you're mainly somebody that cannot really identify with one of these three races. But I'm not saying that you can't. You still have the freedom to choose with one of these three races, or you have the ability to prefer one, or you have the ability to pick them all. Like, it's all up to you. I'm not saying how to identify. This is how one Puerto Rican, me, I am identifying with one race when I'm Puerto Rican. Why? Because it happens. This is one factor. And one of the factors is that physically you will adopt a trait, a characteristic that is mainly from more than one or two ethnicities or one or two races, whether it's Negroid and Mongoloid, Native and Caucasian. You will adopt it. If you have mulatto, you will adopt the physical traits. If you are mainly Caucasian, you will adopt mainly Caucasian. There are the cases where the person may be 99% Caucasian, 1% Native. And sometimes that 1% Native is somehow still expressed in the 99% Caucasian that person is suggesting via DNA test. So, how to identify with one race when you are Puerto Rican? It's all up to you, but there is a genotypical information. There is a phenotypical information, and I suggest that you may follow it, and this is what I am doing. I wanted to make sure why was my look the way that I looked. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the African in me. I didn't see the Caucasian. I didn't see the native. I saw somewhere in between Caucasian and native. And it's really hard for Puerto Ricans like me to identify. It's really hard. So I know that people need their help, and I just hope that I helped you with this video. Accept the way you look and just have fun. Just have fun with all of these percentages, and I'll see you in the next video, and God bless you.